How many times have you heard the expression, the last trump? Well, on today's Prophecy Watchers, we're going to talk about that very phrase, the last trump. I'm Gary Stearman. With me, Bob Ulrich. Hi, Bob.
Always a pleasure, Gary. It's going to be fun today.
We could say we're going to talk about everything you ever wanted to know about trumpets in the Bible. Now, we don't have time for everything, but we're going to do a lot of research.
Of course, those trumpets revolve around the rapture of the church. And if you want to get into uncharted waters and probably make a few enemies along the way, I find it really interesting that probably 80% of the churches in America don't believe in the biblical rapture. And a lot of it revolves around the confusion over a verse in 1 Corinthians that you've written about in our publication, the Prophecy Watcher magazine.
Yeah, and what the trumpets are all about really can be separated in two categories. One category, trumpets from cover to cover in the Bible, basically are command issues. That is to say, when God sounds the trumpet at Mount Sinai, and we'll look at this in a minute, it's his voice that sounds like a trumpet. And he trumpets for a purpose. You go all the way to the end of the book of Revelation, or almost to the end, and you find the seventh trumpet, and it too is a trumpet of command. But in between, Bob, you have the church age. That's where we are right now. The last couple thousand years or so, the church has had an entirely different view of the trumpet. And I want to read 1 Corinthians 15:51. Everybody's heard this verse, probably 100 times or more. Behold, I show you a mystery. And that alone tells me a lot. Listen up, this is a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. And there it is. That is the place in the Bible where you find the phrase, the last trump.
And that one verse has created more confusion about the timing of the rapture. Most Christians believe in the rapture. It's the timing of the rapture that they don't understand. Some people believe we'll be taken before the 7-year tribulation. Some people believe we'll be taken partially through that 7-year tribulation, called the pre-wrath rapture. And then others, which is a complete puzzle to me, is they believe we're going to be on earth for 7 years. We're going to endure the wrath of God. And this verse is a verse that's quoted quite often because it says, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, the dead shall be raised incorruptible, we shall be changed. So is that last trump at the very end of the tribulation? Or is that last trump the rapture of the church?
Well, you've raised the question. Why in the world would 1 Corinthians 15:51 be called the last trump when in fact you go to Revelation and you find 7 trumpets? And you find a trumpet being blown by an angel over there in Revelation. And so why is the one in 1 Corinthians 15:51 called last, when in fact there are other trumpets after that? And there's a really good reason for this.
Well, I can tell you that I have read this article you've written now probably 4 or 5 times. And before we came on the air today, I said, Gary, we could probably shoot 5 programs on this. There's so much meat in here and so much understanding. Let's go back in history to the start of the trumpets in the Roman Empire and rebellious Israel.
Well, let's talk about the time of the apostles. The trumpets, and there were, in fact, in the temple, 2 silver trumpets. And the picture, the carving of some of the loot that was brought back to Rome after the sacking of the temple were 2 silver trumpets paraded in downtown Rome on a rack, along with the golden menorah, as 2 of the top prizes brought back to Titus, or brought back at the time of Titus. And and were memorialized on the Arch of Titus. And why did he pick out those two items, the menorah and the two trumpets? Because the menorah was of top importance spiritually. That is, the high priest, when he marched in to do his priestly duties, would go past that menorah on his left, and he was required to make obeisance in various ways to that menorah. The other items, the silver trumpets, had been commanded to be made by Moses in the long, long distant past, and the tradition of the two silver trumpets came all the way up to the temple. They were different than the shofar blasts that we understand today. The shofar has almost an entirely different history and function than the silver trumpets, which are instruments of command, and we'll see some of the scripture in a moment. But it's kind of complicated, Bob, in a way. In another way, it's very, very simple.
Well, the one thing to recognize is that the Arch of Titus memorialized the destruction of the Jewish temple, and those items were literally pilfered out of the Jewish temple. I love what you wrote in here. The perspective and attitude of Rome was when they took these items, the most important items to the Jewish people, they were proclaiming that your God is dead.
That's right.
And Rome is now ruling the world. So I find there's a lot of symbolism in that Arch of Titus, which I think still stands today, Gary.
Indeed it does. And you can go there and see the engraved trumpets on the arch. And it's phenomenal that they've lasted this long. It's the hand of God as far as I'm concerned. But people talk about the last trump, 1 Corinthians 15:51. Let's talk about the first trump. And I went through this exercise a long time ago, Bob. And when you find the first trump in the Bible, it's in Exodus chapter 19. And looking at verse 16, where it says, "And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount." Of course, this is at the giving of the law. "And the voice of the trumpet exceedingly loud, and all the people that was in the camp trembled." And then you drop down to verse 19, and it says, "Well, the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder. Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice, and the Lord came down on the Mount Sinai." That's the first trumpet in the Bible, and it's the voice of God. Bob, we're waiting for the voice of God.
And that, of course, happened on the Feast of Pentecost.
It did.
And I would have liked, well, maybe, let me take that back. I was going to say I would have liked to have been there that day, but I probably would have been terrified out of my shoes, because you read the description in Exodus about how the Israelites reacted to God coming down on the mountain. I mean, it must have been a surreal moment.
It was a life and death
people.
situation. If you touched the mountain, or if any of your animals touched the mountain, they would die. And then at the giving of the law, there's a long tradition, and we don't have time enough on this program to talk about it, but the holy angels of God flew around the mountain and down among the Israelites and confronted each and every person. Will you keep God's law? And
Wow.
each and every person was required to say yes or no.
Now, I love the way you framed something in the article. You call this the Trumpet of Law. And not to give away, the rest of Gary's article, but later we're going to talk about the Trumpet of Grace. And I think there's a dichotomy there that we need to recognize.
By the way, we should point out here, it's on the table right in front of us, this issue of the Prophecy Watcher. It's August of 2020, and right on the front cover we have the last trump and the picture of those two trumpets. And I think to really catch what we're talking about, you really need to read the whole article. But I want to say something about law and grace. The law was laid down. And when you go over to Numbers and you read what happened in the book of Numbers, and I'm going to find it if I can. You read about Moses receiving the command to craft 2 silver trumpets. This is all after the giving of the law. This is the establishment of worship. This is the establishment of the priesthood. This is the making of the tabernacle, the ark. In Numbers chapter 10, it says, the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, make thee 2 trumpets of silver. Well, there they are. The same ones seen on the Arch of Titus, and the same ones heard at the time of the Roman invasion and capture of Jerusalem. And it says, make them of a whole piece. That, in other words, 1 piece of silver, and that's a technological feat right there. Thou mayest use them, and this is very important, for the calling of the assembly and for the journeying of the camps. And again, we don't have time to read about this, but the calling of the assembly and the journeying of the camps means that these silver trumpets were used as attention getters and as commanding, the articles of command, of a commanding nature. In other words, when the trumpets blow, you'd better be listening. And this was true all the way up to the time when the Idumeans controlled Jerusalem and controlled the temple. Herod the Great built the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. And Bob, to this very day, you can go to Israel and see what is called the trumpeting stone, the stone that was at the top of the southwest wall of the temple, where a trumpeter would stand and blow the trumpet over Jerusalem. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere without hearing this, and he would be sounding the hour of the day, he would be sounding the call to prayer, he would be sounding the call of dismissal. And the Romans hated, and this is on record, by the way. Josephus and some Roman historians have written about how much they hated the sound of that trumpet.
Well, I do find it interesting that in the archaeological remains of the Herod's temple, they actually found the trumpeting stone laying on the ground in rubble, of course, after the destruction. And you were telling me a little earlier about the whole concept of walking up the steps and literally being out on a platform, calling the Israelites to worship, whether it was the Sabbath or a feast day, which we actually have archaeological evidence that stone actually really existed on the temple site.
You can still see it, and by the way, they have carved an exact replica of it in beautiful Hebrew, stylized Hebrew. And it was a very, very important part of the temple. And the fascinating thing to me, Bob, is that the 2 silver trumpets were used exactly as described in Numbers. Now, again, and I wish we had time to go back, but you can read for yourself in the book of Numbers all of the different trumpet commands. When the children of Israel traveled, when they set up the tabernacle and worshiped, there were different, if you will, encoded trumpet calls. And these trumpet calls became infused into the Israelite society. In other words, they became a very, very big part of things. Now, I want to skip back, and we read 1 Corinthians 15, where the last trump is seen, and I'm now going to go over to 1 Thessalonians 4. The rapture, called the last trump in 1 Corinthians 15. Here, everybody knows this verse, 1 Corinthians 4:16, for the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, and the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Here we have the trump. And again, it is in the New Testament Greek, it's salpinge, which is a metal trumpet. So that we know that a metal trumpet is not a shofar, not a ceremonial shofar. This is a serious call. And it's the call for the church to come up into heaven and receive their glorified bodies, and then ceremonially to proceed forth to the days of judgment. Because when the rapture comes, a while later, and people debate about how long or how many years later, a while later is going to come another set of trumpets, of 7 trumpets in Revelation. Bob, there's a lot of discussion about those trumpets in Revelation. Some people even saying that the one in 1 Thessalonians is the same as the 7th trumpet in Revelation.
And that certainly creates a tremendous amount of confusion when you don't understand what Paul is actually saying. Now, if you actually go back to Thessalonians, that was the first epistle that the Apostle Paul wrote.
Right.
And at the time, the Jewish temple was in place, and you can see from the reaction between the first book and the second book of Thessalonians that the people were in a state of panic. Well, why wouldn't they be in a panic? They were told that the Antichrist was going to set foot in the temple and declare himself to be God. And of course, the temple was there. So again, it's context. And so you can understand why they were shook up thinking that the Antichrist is, we've missed the rapture of the church.
Mm-hmm. Thessalonians was written before Corinthians. So the first mention is called the trump of God. The second mention, written by Paul, is called the last trump. And the question is, last what? Why is it called last? What is it the last of? You go over to Revelation chapter 11, and the 7th angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And this is the 7th or last trump in Revelation 11. So if it's called the last trump in 1 Corinthians 15, why is it not called the last trump? And why is it not the same trumpet as we find in Revelation 11?
Certainly trumpets of judgment that we see in the book of Revelation compared to the trumpets we see in Thessalonians and Corinthians.
Fascinating, though, that the last trump in Revelation does something. And it's just like back in the old days, the Old Testament. A trumpet call requires a response. Well, the response of the 7th trumpet in Revelation is the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. And so we have the ceremonial opening of the temple in heaven at the sounding of the 7th trumpet of Revelation. Now, you can read this all day long, Bob, and you'll never see rapture.
Well, I love the comment you made. This is not the trumpet that calls the faithful home. And I'll read just a little quick paragraph here that you've written, which I think is really a great analogy. Again, just as divine fire descended upon Mount Sinai, tongues of fire encircled the heads of Israel's faithful. But this time the message was grace, not law. This time there was no frightening trumpet blast, only the declaration of good news and the joy of those receiving it in their own languages. So we have 2 completely different trumpets that confuse a lot of people.
Yeah, nothing could be more different than the last trump that calls the church home and the 7th trumpet of Revelation, which opens the temple in heaven. And guess who's already there when the 7th trumpet sounds in Revelation? The 24 elders representing the church. They're already there before this trumpet is blown. So to me, there's just absolutely no possibility that we could be talking about the rapture in Revelation chapter 11.
Now, let's go to Matthew 24, because this is another verse that's taken out of context constantly. Just check our Facebook page sometime and see the comments. It's very easy to be confused about this. And it says, and he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet. Mm-hmm. They shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Well, Gary, who are the elect in Matthew 24? Isn't that the church at the end of the tribulation?
It would be, but maybe not.
Scared me for a minute.
A lot of people say, well, yes, but no, the church has already done a remarkable thing by the time this happens, Bob. This is happening at the end of the tribulation, 7-year tribulation. And by the time of the end, the church has already been established with its 24 elders. The seals have already been opened. The various ceremonial duties, such as the one, the blowing of the seventh trumpet, which opens the temple in heaven. All of these things have happened by this time, Bob.
Now, you won't find the rapture in Matthew 24. In fact, you don't find the rapture in the New Testament until the 14th chapter of John, where it's actually introduced by Jesus. You move through the New Testament and you find it again in the epistles of the Apostle Paul, who described it as a mystery. Then you move all the way to the book of Revelation, and of course you see it described by the Apostle John
Right.
In the 4th chapter, where a door is opened in heaven and a voice says, "Come up hither." And I think all of us are looking forward to that day. But one other area of this verse in Matthew 24 I want you to address, Gary, because when it talks about the elect, this is where people really get confused and take things out of context. You know, there's a lot of people who believe that no one will be saved during the tribulation. You know, the rapture of the church happens, millions of Christians disappear from planet Earth, and there's a period of time, there may be a gap between the rapture and the start of the tribulation, but when the tribulation begins, people obviously are still being saved, right? So are they the elect?
The elect, as given in Matthew 24, are the verses 31 through 35 are very, very clearly Israel, and they have gone through the tribulation. And this is when he sends his angels forth with a great sound of the trumpet. And when you read verses 32 through 35, you're reading the parable of the fig tree. Well, the fig tree is Israel, and I don't think anyone differs from that interpretation. And so Jesus then concludes this dissertation in verse 34 by saying, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." This is a generation. It's not the church, it's a generation. And it's the house of David. It is the generation, the summation of the many, many generations of Israel come down at last to the point where they will receive the promises of God.
Now stop and think about it logically for just a second. The tribulation starts, the Bible calls it the worst time in the history of the world, 7 years. Now, if you're a Christian alive at the beginning of the tribulation, there's no doubt in order to keep your faith, you're saved after the rapture, you enter the tribulation. In order to keep your faith, you're going to die as a martyr for the cause of Christ. You're not going to be protected during the tribulation, by any divine power. Revelation 13:7 is very clear that the Antichrist is given the power to overcome the saints. So at the end of 7 years, there's not a whole lot of Christians left alive, are there, Gary?
Not a lot of Christians left alive because there's great martyrdom during that period, and it's plainly spoken and illustrated that there's great martyrdom, even among those who have received Christ, and there will be apparently thousands who do. To recap, the first trumpet in the Bible is the trumpet of the giving of the law and the instructions of the law itself. Those instructions include the crafting of 2 silver trumpets, which become the instruments of order all the way down through the life of Israel, through the tabernacle era, through the first and second temple era, through the era of the temple under the marauders who have taken control of it by the time Jesus came. And so you have this long, long, long history of the trumpets and Israel, and you have the same tradition then continuing over, if you will, into the summation of God's plan, which you find in the book of Revelation. And in between, Bob, and I'd like to be clear about this, in 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4, you have the trumpet called 2 different things, the trump of God and the last trump. And in both cases, it's doing one act. It's performing one act, and that is calling home the saints before the judgment day comes.
Gary, you have produced an hour-long DVD. Ironically, it's called The Last Trump. And we've covered actually quite a bit of material on the program today, but there's a whole lot more in your article. This is an hour-long presentation on the whole history of the trumpets of the rapture, the trumpets of judgment. Everything you read in Gary's article is performed here live. And I got to tell you, you've never seen or heard anything like this before. I've never read or seen anything like this ever before. Now, we do have a magazine called The Prophecy Watcher, and I know tens of thousands of you do read the publication every month. If you're not a subscriber to our publication, we'd love to have you subscribe to the magazine at prophecywatchers.com, or you can call the toll-free number on the screen. Got a great surprise for you. We'd love to send you a copy of the Last Trump DVD for free. We'll even ship it to you for free with your subscription to the Prophecy Watcher. Now, we also have a little package. If you really want to become an expert on the rapture of the church, and trust me, there is a tremendous amount of confusion out there. Gary has produced a series of DVDs, not just on the Last Trump, but a DVD entitled The Rapture is the Resurrection. And this talks about the actual end of the church age.
Yes.
When that trumpet of grace sounds, that actually brings the church age to a conclusion. So the rapture is actually the resurrection, the final ending of the church age. Tremendous hour-long presentation. We've also got an interview Gary did with prophecy legend Tommy Ice, who may be the leading rapture expert alive in the world today, other than you.
Oh, I bow to Tommy Ice, believe me. And when I talk about the rapture being the resurrection, what I mean is the rapture is the resurrection of the church.
Exactly. So we've got 3 DVDs here. The Last Trump, The Rapture is the Resurrection, and Defending the Rapture, which is actually 2 DVDs with Gary and Tommy really handling all the objections that people have. When you get the Last Trump package, we've also got 2 free bonuses that I know are going to be exciting. Ask the Experts, a Q&A on the rapture with 5 tremendous Bible scholars. And this is very special. Tim LaHaye's last Bible prophecy message. You're going to hear a complete explanation on the subject of Bible prophecy that I know is not only going to be encouraging, but really enlightening. And Tim has gone to be with the Lord now, but his work lives on. Gary?
Amen. And he did such yeoman work while he was alive, and believe me, he was watching for the rapture, and so are we.
And listening.
And listening for what is variously called the trump of God or the last trump. And we've just barely scratched the surface of this topic. In the article and the DVDs, you'll find much, much more. Right, Bob?
Amen. Subscribe to the publication, get the DVD for free.
I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, you keep watching. We are.